In 1903, a crew of copper miners in Globe, Arizona broke through a wall that had no business being there. They were at the end of a routine expansion tunnel 800 feet below the surface when their picks hit something strange. Not rock, not ore, something smooth, something dressed. A worked stone wall running the width of the tunnel, perfectly fitted, no mortar, no gaps. The kind of masonry that took skill to build. The kind of skill that nobody in 1903 could explain. They widened the opening. What they found on the other side stopped the entire operation. The tunnel stretched back into the darkness in both directions. It was not a natural cave. The walls were cut. The ceiling was arched. The floor had been leveled. Whatever this place was, it had been built. Built deep, built precisely, and built so long ago that the copper ore the miners were chasing had grown over the entrance like a second skin. The foreman sent word up to the surface. Company officials came down. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. And within 72 hours, without explanation, without public statement, and without allowing the miners back in, the entire section was sealed with blasting powder and filled with rubble. By Monday morning there was nothing left to see. The official word was that the tunnel posed a structural risk, that the company had filled it for safety, that there was nothing of interest and nothing to report. 3 of the miners who were there told a different story until the day they died. Globe, Arizona in 1903 was a boomtown. The old Dominion Copper Company had turned desert scrubland into one of the most productive mining operations in the American West. The ore was rich. The investors were happy. The crews worked rotating shifts, drilling and blasting and hauling copper out of the earth in quantities that made company shareholders wealthy and made Globe a name that appeared on financial reports in New York and London. By 1903, the Old Dominion had sunk multiple shafts to varying depths and networked them with horizontal tunnels called drifts. Mining engineers were constantly pushing new exploratory tunnels into uncharted rock, following the veins, mapping what lay beneath. It was one of these exploratory tunnels, pushed into a section designated on company maps as the East Extension, that produced the discovery that was never supposed to become a story. The crew working the East Extension in the spring of 1903 consisted of 8 men. The foreman was a man with considerable underground experience, someone who had worked mines in Colorado and Nevada before coming to Arizona. He knew what natural rock formations looked like. He knew what caves looked like. He knew what he was seeing when his crew broke through into something that was neither. The initial breakthrough happened on a Wednesday. The account that circulated in Globe in the days that followed, pieced together from what the miners told their families and what a local newspaper attempted to report before being told to drop the story, described a section of dressed stone behind the broken rock face. The miners used picks and pry bars to widen the opening. What they entered was a passage. The passage ran east to west relative to their tunnel. Its dimensions were consistent throughout, roughly 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall. The ceiling was arched rather than flat, a deliberate architectural choice that distributes load more effectively than a flat span, and that is characteristic of construction traditions predating European contact in the Americas by a very long time. The floor showed signs of having been worked, smoothed and levelled, with what appeared to be a shallow channel or groove running along one wall. The walls themselves were composed of fitted stone blocks, each block interlocking with its neighbours without mortar, a technique that appears in ancient structures from the Andes to the Mediterranean, and that modern engineers have described as more earthquake-resistant than mortared construction. What the miners knew was simpler. Someone had built this. Someone had built it far underground, with skill, and the rock around it had been undisturbed long enough that copper ore had mineralized over parts of the entrance wall, a process that takes, depending on local geology, anywhere from several hundred to several thousand years. They went back in the next morning with better lighting. What they found on the second day expanded the mystery considerably. The passage the miners had broken into was not a single tunnel. It was part of a network. Moving east from the entry point, after approximately 60 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 40 feet across at its widest point. The ceiling vaulted upward to somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. The floor was paved. Flat stones had been laid in a pattern that several miners later described as deliberate, not random, not the result of natural fracturing, but arranged. Whether that arrangement carried symbolic meaning or was purely functional, nobody wrote down in enough detail to say. In the chamber walls there were openings. At least 3 passages led away in different directions. The miners followed 2 of them briefly before deciding to go back, report what they had found, and wait for guidance from the surface. The passages showed the same construction quality as the main tunnel. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Fitted stone, arched ceilings, worked floors. The 3rd passage from the chamber was blocked, not collapsed, blocked. Someone had placed large stones across the opening deliberately, stacking them in a way that sealed the passage from the chamber side. Whatever was on the other side, the miners did not find out. There was not time. There were other details in the accounts that have survived in fragmentary form. Objects that appeared to have been placed in niches cut into the chamber walls, though the miners could not identify what those objects were in the brief time they had. Markings on certain wall sections described as carved lines and shapes. A smell in the chamber that the miners described as dry and strange, not the typical mineral and earth smell of a working mine, something older. By the end of the 2nd day, the company superintendent had been notified. 2 men from upper management travelled down to examine what had been found. They spent time in the chamber and the passages, and when they came back up, the decision had already been made. The miners were told the section was unsafe, that there were concerns about structural integrity given the proximity to active blasting in adjacent tunnels, that the company would seal the area before any further examination. This was framed as a temporary measure, a standard safety protocol. It was not temporary. The blasting began the following evening and did not stop until the entire east extension, the passage, the chamber, and everything in it was rubble and fill. There is a question that needs to be addressed before going further, because this story sits in a space where serious historical inquiry and speculative mythology tend to collide. What we know is that the Old Dominion copper mine existed and was one of the most significant mining operations in territorial Arizona. What we know is that its records are incomplete, with significant gaps in the archival record around the 1903 to 1905 period. What we know is that several individuals in the Globe area told consistent stories about an unusual discovery in the mine that was quickly suppressed, stories specific enough in their details to distinguish them from generic local legend. The Tartaria framework, as it has come to be called across thousands of hours of independent research, is not a single unified theory. It is a cluster of observations. The observation that certain architectural features appear in ancient structures across geographic distances that conventional historical timelines struggle to explain. The observation that certain technologies appear in ruins worldwide that predate the civilizations to which they are conventionally attributed. The observation that the historical record contains gaps and contradictions that are not resolved by mainstream scholarship, but papered over. The observation that when anomalous evidence surfaces, it has a documented tendency to disappear. The Old Dominion discovery fits this pattern precisely, but it is one data point among many. The American Southwest is, archaeologically speaking, one of the most contested and inadequately explained regions on Earth. The conventional account holds that indigenous peoples arrived in the Americas via a land bridge from Asia between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, spread across the continent, developed agriculture, built modest structures, and remained essentially in a pre-contact state until European arrival in the late 15th century. This account has problems. the Hohokam culture, which occupied the region around what is now Phoenix, and extends south toward Globe and the Old Dominion mine site, built one of the most sophisticated irrigation canal systems in the pre-Columbian world. Over 500 miles of engineered canals precisely graded to maintain water flow across flat desert terrain, capable of supporting a population in the tens of thousands. The engineering precision required, the understanding of hydrology, gradient and flow management, is not primitive. It requires surveying technology, sustained institutional organization, and accumulated engineering knowledge across multiple generations. When Spanish explorers encountered the canal system in the 16th century, it was already abandoned. The Hohokam were already gone. The people living in the region at the time of European contact, the O'odham and their neighbours, had no clear oral tradition connecting themselves to the canal builders. The canals were already ancient to them. The conventional dating puts Hohokam fluorescence at roughly 700 CE to 1450 CE, but that dating is based on artifacts found at certain sites. It does not account for the possibility that the infrastructure itself is older than the culture that last used it. What archaeology identifies as Hohokam may represent a later occupation of an already existing landscape of built infrastructure, a population moving into and using structures and systems they did not themselves build, and the Old Dominion mine sits not far from the northernmost extent of that canal network. It sits above whatever it was that those miners found 800 feet underground in 1903. The question of underground construction in the American Southwest is one that mainstream archaeology approaches with extreme caution. There are documented examples of underground construction in pre-Columbian North America. The ancestral Puebloans built kivas, circular subterranean ceremonial chambers found throughout the Four Corners region. These are acknowledged, dated, analysed, and incorporated into the conventional narrative. But the kiva tradition represents relatively shallow, relatively small construction, ceremonially oriented and associated with identified cultural groups whose descendant communities still exist. What the Old Dominion miners described is categorically different. 800 feet underground, extensive horizontal passages, a central chamber with multiple egress points, arched construction, fitted stone without mortar, a sealed passage. This is not a kiva, this is infrastructure. Something built to last, built deep, built to serve a function that required hundreds of feet of rock overhead. The construction technique of fitted stone without mortar appears in a specific context in the global archaeological record that has never been satisfactorily explained by conventional frameworks. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman contain fitted stone so precise that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between the blocks. The stones weigh hundreds of tons. The Inca claimed these structures as their own, but their oral traditions describe finding them already in place and building upon what was already there. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, dated to approximately 10,000 BCE, pushed the acknowledged timeline of organized architectural construction back by roughly 6,000 years. The site was buried deliberately, its builders filling it with debris and covering it over in an act of concealment whose motivation remains unexplained. The pattern across these sites and dozens of others is not one of a single culture building in a single place and time. It is a pattern of engineering principles appearing across vast geographic and temporal distances in ways that the conventional account of human history cannot straightforwardly explain. The alternative explanation, the one the Tartaria framework has been developing across thousands of hours of primary source research, photographic analysis, and architectural comparison, is that what we are seeing is the remnant of a single broader civilization, a global or near-global tradition of construction and organization that predates the historical period by a considerable margin, and whose existence has been systematically obscured by the institutions that control the narrative of human origins. What the Old Dominion miners found in 1903 would have been a data point of extraordinary significance. It was destroyed within 72 hours of being found. The decision to destroy the chamber was made within hours of senior company officials seeing it. Whatever they saw, They moved very fast to make it disappear. The suppression of anomalous archaeological discovery. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical phenomenon with enough specific examples to constitute a pattern. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a story describing the discovery by a Smithsonian-affiliated explorer named G.E. Kincaid of an extensive underground city within the Grand Canyon walls. The article described tunnels, chambers, artifacts of apparent Egyptian or Tibetan character, mummies and inscriptions. The Smithsonian Institution has consistently denied that any such explorer existed in their records or that any such expedition took place. Either the Arizona Gazette fabricated an elaborate story with specific names, dates, locations, and institutional affiliations for reasons that have never been explained, or the Smithsonian's records have been selectively maintained. Those are the two options. There is no third option that resolves the contradiction without implying that someone is not telling the truth. In 1934, near Lovelock in Nevada, archaeologists excavating a cave found evidence of a pre-contact population significantly taller than the known indigenous peoples of the region, with hair that some accounts describe as red or auburn. The finds were documented partially and then largely disappeared from the academic literature. The Paiute people of the region have oral traditions describing an ancient war against a race of red-haired people who lived in the caves. When the oral tradition and the archaeological record point at the same thing, and both are ignored by mainstream scholarship, that is not an accident. That is a choice. The pattern is structural rather than conspiratorial. Academic careers are built on published work evaluated by peer reviewers who work within established frameworks. Evidence that challenges foundational assumptions of a field is not suppressed by evil individuals in darkrooms. It is suppressed by the ordinary operation of institutions that have powerful incentives to maintain the coherence of the narrative they have built their reputations on. The Old Dominion Copper Company had different but equally powerful incentives. A significant archaeological discovery in an active mine creates complications. It creates delays. It attracts regulatory scrutiny and potential preservation requirements. In 1903, in territorial Arizona, before federal archaeological protection laws existed in any robust form, a mining company had essentially complete authority over what happened on its property underground, and the Old Dominion chose to exercise that authority in the most complete way possible. There is a man named James Crumb who appears in the oral history of Globe, Arizona, in a way that deserves attention. Crumb was a mining engineer who worked in the Globe region in the early 20th century. He was not an Old Dominion employee, but a consultant who worked with multiple operations in the area. According to accounts gathered by a local historian in Globe in the 1940s, appearing in a privately published history of Gila County circulating in a small number of library collections, Crumb was one of the individuals who went underground to examine the discovery in 1903. He was brought in as an independent expert as near as can be reconstructed at the request of someone on the crew. What Crumb told the local historian 40 years later was this: the chamber was real. The construction was unlike anything he had seen in his career, which included time in mines across the American West and in South America. The stone fitting was precise beyond anything he could account for, with the tools and methods he knew. The chamber itself had an atmosphere he described as having weight to it, as if the air inside had been sealed for a very long time. He said that in the brief time he was in the chamber, he counted the openings in the walls and tallied 7, not 3 as the miners had described to their families. He said that what appeared to be inscriptions on one wall section resembled nothing he had seen in any language, ancient or modern, that he was familiar with. He also said that after the blasting was complete and the section filled, he was contacted by a representative of the company and asked to sign a statement confirming that the section had been found unstable and filled for safety reasons. He signed it. He was told that the information was proprietary and that he should not discuss what he had seen. He obeyed that instruction for approximately 40 years before speaking to the local historian. He died in 1947. His family was traced in the 1970s by a researcher following up on the local historian's account. His son confirmed that his father had told essentially the same story within the family privately over the years. The son said his father had been troubled by it, not by having signed the statement, by what he had seen in the chamber and by not knowing what it was. This is the texture of suppressed history, not a dramatic cover-up. An old mining engineer signing a company document because that was the expected thing to do in 1903, and then living with what he knew for 40 years before finally telling someone carefully, in terms that were specific enough to be credible and humble enough to acknowledge what he did not and could not know. Crumb did not claim to know who built the tunnels. He claimed to know that someone had built them, that they were old, that they were sophisticated, and that the people who had the power to decide what happened to them chose to destroy them rather than study them. The broader landscape of the American Southwest contains a remarkable density of unexplained anomalies. In the Four Corners region, the Chaco Canyon complex represents an achievement of architectural and astronomical sophistication that the conventional account has never fully explained. The great houses of Chaco Canyon, particularly Pueblo Bonito, contain construction quality that exceeds what small bands of subsistence-level farmers could plausibly achieve. The astronomical alignments of the structures, with key architectural features oriented to solar and lunar cycles requiring sustained observation across multiple generations, imply an institutional continuity and a knowledge-keeping tradition that the conventional population estimates for Chaco Canyon do not support. More provocative is the evidence that the great houses were built in phases, with the oldest sections showing the most sophisticated construction and later additions showing progressively less precise work. This is the reverse of what you would expect from a culture learning and refining its craft over time. It suggests the most sophisticated sections were built first by builders who knew exactly what they were doing, and that later occupants added to those structures as best they could with skills that did not match those of whoever built the original cores. The Hopi oral tradition, maintained with unusual discipline and detail across generations, describes a sequence of worlds, with the current world being the fourth or fifth, depending on the specific tradition. The people who survived the destruction of the preceding world did so by going underground, guided by the Ant People, a figure that appears in various forms across Native American traditions, and that has attracted considerable attention from researchers examining evidence of actual underground refugees or constructed underground spaces. Whether the Ant People are metaphor or memory, and whether they represent something like what the Old Dominion miners found in 1903, is a question that a destroyed chamber cannot answer. The timeline question is the one the Tartaria framework keeps returning to, because the timeline is the key to everything. If the conventional timeline is correct, underground construction of the scale and quality described in the Old Dominion accounts should not have existed in the American Southwest in the pre-contact period. The cultures present in the region did not, according to the conventional narrative, build at that depth, with that technique, on that scale. The geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre was a researcher working for the United States Geological Survey, who in 1973 conducted multiple independent dating methods at the Hueyatlaco site in Mexico, where stone tools and animal bones had been found in apparent association. Her results placed the age of the site at approximately 250,000 years, meaning human tool use activity in the Americas approximately 230,000 years before the conventional date for human arrival in the hemisphere. She reported her findings. The results were disputed, minimized, and eventually her career was effectively ended. The Hueyatlaco site was not further excavated by US government-funded archaeologists. Her findings were published eventually in a non-mainstream venue after mainstream journals declined to run them. 250,000 years of human presence in the Americas before the conventional timeline starts would require not just a revision, but a complete rebuilding of the framework of American prehistory. It would mean that whatever civilization developed in the Americas over that span left traces that we have not found and not acknowledged, or found and destroyed. It would mean that the Old Dominion chamber, wherever it falls on that extended timeline, might represent something much closer to the beginning of that story than the end. The reset hypothesis holds that the current phase of human civilization, beginning with the acknowledged emergence of complex urban society in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 3000 BCE, is not the first such phase, but the most recent one following a catastrophic interruption. The nature of the interruption is debated. Candidates include a pole shift event, a cometary impact series, a period of extreme volcanic activity, a geomagnetic reversal, or some combination of factors. The evidence includes geological anomalies, unusual features in the global sediment record, unexplained dating anomalies at multiple archaeological sites, and the widespread presence in oral traditions across cultures of stories about a great destruction followed by a rebuilding. The Younger Dryas impact event, the evidence for which has been accumulating in peer-reviewed geological literature since 2007, provides a plausible mechanism for exactly this kind of civilizational disruption. The Younger Dryas cooling event began approximately 12,900 years ago and caused a rapid and severe global temperature drop, followed by roughly 200 years of cooler conditions. The impact hypothesis, proposing that this was triggered by the fragmentation of a comet across multiple northern hemisphere impact sites, has moved from fringe to contested but serious within mainstream geology over the last 15 years. The Hiawatha impact crater discovered under the Greenland ice sheet in 2018, dated to approximately 12,000 years ago, adds physical evidence to the case. If a civilization of significant complexity existed before the Younger Dryas impact event, it would have been concentrated in the climatically favourable zones of the late Pleistocene, many of which are now underwater or dramatically altered. A civilization struck by the equivalent of several simultaneous nuclear winters would have suffered catastrophic losses. Survivors would have carried knowledge with them, but that knowledge, embodied in people rather than in documents or infrastructure, would have degraded across generations as surviving populations struggled with a fundamentally altered world. The deep underground construction that appears at multiple sites, including the proposed Old Dominion chamber, could represent pre-reset infrastructure. Infrastructure built before the catastrophe by builders who had no expectation of discontinuity, who built for permanence, and who were in some cases, as at Göbekli Tepe, engaged in deliberate acts of preservation and concealment as the catastrophe approached. One of the more striking parallels to the Old Dominion situation occurred in Turkey in 1963. The Derinkuyu underground city in Cappadocia was discovered when a resident renovating his home broke through a wall into a tunnel. Subsequent exploration revealed an underground complex capable of housing approximately 20,000 people across 18 stories extending to a depth of approximately 280 feet. It included living quarters, livestock stables, wineries, oil presses, water wells, ventilation shafts, and a church. The construction is of exceptional quality. Who originally built it, as opposed to who most recently modified and used it, remains an open question. Derinkuyu was preserved because it was discovered by a private citizen rather than by a corporate entity with an interest in it not existing, and because the Turkish government had different institutional responses to such discoveries than American mining companies in 1903. Imagine if the Derinkuyu discovery had been made by a mining company. The Derinkuyu decision would have looked a great deal like the Old Dominion decision. The difference between the preservation of Derinkuyu and the destruction of whatever was found in Globe Arizona is not about the significance of the discovery. It is about the institutional context in which the discovery was made and the power available to the individuals who made the first decisions about what to do with it. The Old Dominion Copper Company was not unusual in its decision. It was doing exactly what any extractive industrial operation would do when faced with a discovery that complicated its operations and offered no economic benefit. The abnormality is in the magnitude of what was lost. The final thing to examine is what happened to the people who knew. The 8 miners who first broke through were not, as far as surviving records indicate, asked to sign anything or directly threatened. They talked, within their families and within the mining community of Globe, as people talk when they have seen something remarkable. The stories they told circulated in a limited way for a limited time, and then faded, as stories do, when there is no physical evidence to anchor them, when the people who tell them grow older and move on and die, and when the institutional weight of the official account fills the silence. The foreman of the crew is identified in one account by an initial that suggests his surname but not his full name. He left Globe within a year of the discovery. Whether the departure was coincidental or consequential cannot be established from available information. The local newspaper that initially attempted to report on the discovery was told to drop the story. Newspapers in 1903 in mining towns were economically dependent on the mining industry. Telling a newspaper in Globe, Arizona to drop a story about the Old Dominion Copper Company was not a difficult conversation to have. What this means is that the suppression of the Old Dominion discovery required no dramatic conspiracy. It required a mining company making an economically rational decision quickly. It required the ordinary social dynamics by which powerful institutions communicate to local media that certain stories are not worth pursuing. It required the normal human behavior of people who signed things they were asked to sign and did not speak about things they were asked not to speak about for the duration of their professional lives. And it required time, which did the rest. The tunnel was filled by Monday. Whatever was down there, 800 feet below the desert floor, fitted stone and arched ceilings and a sealed passage leading somewhere further in, is rubble now. Has been rubble for over 120 years. The copper ore that grew back over the entrance wall before the miners found it had taken centuries to form. The rubble that replaced the chamber will compact and mineralize over the same kind of time frame. Whatever was there will not be found again in any of our lifetimes. But the question it represents does not go away with the physical evidence. Somebody built those tunnels. Somebody fitted that stone. Somebody arched that ceiling and leveled that floor and ran that groove along that wall and placed objects in those niches and carved those marks and sealed that passage and went away. They were real. What they built was real. 8 miners saw it, and a mining engineer examined it, and a company official made a decision within 72 hours. And the blasting crew executed that decision, and by Monday morning it was gone. But the question remains, who built what is under the American Southwest? How long has it been there? How much of it is left? And why does the evidence for it keep disappearing? Those are not questions with comfortable answers. They are questions that the established institutions of scholarship and industry have demonstrated, repeatedly and specifically, that they would rather bury than answer. The Old Dominion chamber is gone, but the pattern it belongs to is still visible for anyone willing to look at it clearly.